This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good evening and welcome to the Friday Twilight Show with me, Claire Cannon. Thank you for joining me here on Teachers Talk Radio. There's a lot being said at the moment about behaviour and what schools can do to help students who are struggling. So tonight I look at what can be done to support those most in need and also the inequity in the system regarding access to alternative provision.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Thank you again for joining me this evening on the Twilight Show. I'm talking this evening about how we can support which challenges us and social norms, and particularly those students who have
You've been listening to
the in-house support and students who are likely to need something more. This is often termed alternative provision. Some schools might refer to it as an inclusion hub or some kind of nest or nook or some other phrasing around having them in school but having a very different sort of timetable and setup. And that's all around supporting those social, emotional, mental health needs, or SEMH, and also preventing suspensions and exclusion, which we know often has its own sort of negative outcomes that stem from those sanctions. And I'm sure, those of you listening who work in schools, probably most of you, I'm sure we can all bring to mind a student whose behaviour, it is a cause for concern, whether that's foul language, missing lessons, defiance, and other issues that prevent them, and sometimes, let's face it, others, from being able to access their learning. So, in a world where, quite rightly, we are talking about equity rather than equality, I'm going to spend some of the show this evening talking about how it is that there is such disparity in what schools and students are able to access when they get to the point of needing that alternative provision. And it does very much seem like it's a postcode lottery in terms of what support can be accessed, because in some areas there's some really, really high quality provision and there's various options available. However, in other areas there's not necessarily the places, there's not necessarily the quality there that we know these students need. Interestingly, before I sort of go on, I just wanted to pick up also on the fact that the Ofsted got their big listen at the moment. So, looking for all sorts of perspectives on education. However, I did notice when I went to fill it in that I couldn't actually say that I worked in alternative provision because that option isn't there. So we have this opportunity called the big listen, but if you work in alternative provision, you can't actually say that that's what you do. You can tick other, but to me that doesn't seem quite right that we are just classed as other. Anyway, so going to have a think this evening about types of provision that can be offered, because not all alternative provisions are the same. I can see that I've got Grant, so good evening Grant. I can see you have joined me already this evening, which is lovely, and Brandon, I've just seen you join as well, so thank you. But later on, I'm going to be having a chat with Grant, who is a head teacher in a secondary school in Lincolnshire, who's kindly said he'd join me tonight to share his experiences of trying to support these pupils that have these SEMH needs and the challenges that he faces in trying to do the right thing and trying to support these students, and what he would like to see improve in terms of their them having equitable access. So anybody listening, if you've got any thoughts and experiences regarding accessing alternative provision, please do text in. It would be lovely to hear from you. So a little bit of background I thought here, because I work in alternative provision, so to me it's sort of my bread and butter, but perhaps it's not for everybody in terms of knowing what it's all about and why schools might use them. So gets shortened to AP, alternative provision, often shortened to AP. They are settings, can be, sort of educational institutions like a school, but there can be other setups as well. They cater to students who, for various reasons, cannot thrive in a mainstream educational setting. And quite often that presents as behaviours that challenge. And I say that phrase on purpose, behaviours that challenge. I prefer that to the phrase challenging behaviour, because I feel that if you say a pupil has challenging behaviour or shows challenging behaviour, it's a bit like a limiting phrase on them, really, in terms of supporting change and promoting positive development. And also how that pupil is seen by themselves and others. So, for example, saying, pupil X shows behaviours that challenge us rather than has challenging behaviours, because they're not inherently built in. These are quite often behaviours that are born of experience, in some cases born of essentially a survival need. They are a survival mechanism. So that, anyway, that's me. That's my little take on things. It is behaviours that challenge, or behaviours that challenge us. So back to APs. These might include traditional state-funded schools and academies, and that's, as I say, some schools that have got something in-house. The school where I work in is its own entity. It is a school in its own right. There are actually two sites, one on either side of the county, and we run, like any other school. We have our lessons, our structures, our teaching staff, our support staff. But increasingly, these APs, or what schools can access as AP, are also private organisations. Lots of schools may have accessed things like equine therapy, boxing. There can be sort of gyms, physical outlets, and in some cases, there are access to sort of more therapeutic provisions. But again, I think the fact that, I'm saying sometimes, maybe, is highlighting the fact that there is this inequity in the system, that it does depend on where you live and where you go to school as to what you can access. Now, the concept of alternative provision recognises that, not all students fit neatly into a box. They're square pegs in a round hole, and they don't necessarily follow the conventional sort of educational mould. They require some kind of tailoring to their learning. That could be subtle, but in some cases it can be really quite significant. So, the young people that come to the AP where I work, they will experience periods of dysregulation, and that can show as being unable to go into a lesson or unable to stay. Sometimes presents as swearing, bad language, saying they won't do things, not always complying with the expectations that, and the behaviours that we want from them. Those things can change quite rapidly, and I think of a young person who's joined our school quite recently and followed a pretty typical pattern of coming in and saying, I'm not doing the work, I'm not going to lessons, you can't make me. And actually, with the ratios of staffing that we've got, with the additional training and the trauma-informed practice that we have, it's taken only 2 weeks, and we now have that young person in their lesson. But the class sizes are that much smaller. The environment is quieter. The work is much more tailored. If they need a break, they can have that break, and they're not feeling that they can't do it, or they're going to get perhaps a consequence for taking a break out of the class. And you really do see that change quite quickly with the young people who come to us. And often they want, it's not because they don't want to learn, they do, but they've just been in an environment where they can't flourish. And actually somebody gave me a nice analogy the other day, because they said, if you put a plant in the wrong environment, it won't grow. And it's the same for our students. You put them in the wrong environment and they won't grow, they won't flourish, and they won't thrive. So as I say, I sort of mentioned there that, we're tailoring what we do much more than perhaps, this is no criticism of mainstream. Mainstream serves its function, does so well. But we can tailor a lot of what we're doing much more. We have the ability to be flexible in a way that would be very difficult for a mainstream setting. If I'm, for example, a person that is trusted by a student and something has happened, I can swap out of my lesson. There's other staff around that can pick up that content for me and run the lesson while I'm supporting that student. So it's not just about, go and find your head of year at lunchtime. You can have your person now, and that is very different. And obviously those levels of, let's say, flexibility are very, very difficult. And I come from a mainstream background, so I've seen both sides of the coin. And I would say on that, if anyone is in mainstream and considering, what it would be like to work in an AP, could I go and work there? What go and do it. It's brilliant, and you will have a lot to learn, but the impact and the outcomes you can have are truly amazing. They really are. And you will get to know the students on a very different level, which is very rewarding, as much as sometimes can be very challenging too, but the rewards far outweigh that. So, alternative provision, we've got the recognition that students do come from diverse backgrounds, they possess unique learning needs. Alternative provisions can offer different programs. I've mentioned things like the equine therapy, which obviously is very unique sort of setup, and a very focused setup. If you go somewhere for equine therapy, you're going to be working with horses. But sometimes it's giving students a different way of learning, so a more practical, vocational based way of learning. For some students, being inside is actually a barrier to their education. So there are lots of APs that offer outdoor learning, whether that's outward bound type things, whether they offer, there's sort of archery, there's canoeing, fishing, and a lot of those are with a one-to-one. They're with a mentor that can really get to know that student and start to build the relationships that for a lot of them they possibly have never had. They might not have had a positive relationship or not have had a stable relationship, and that can, present as issues regarding sort of trusting adults and relying on adults and feeling that adults will actually support them at their point of need. And I think the real key thing for me is there is always a reason when a student is behaving in such a way for such a prolonged time. Of course, students can make choices. I've done it as a student myself. I'm sure we all have sometimes just decided not to do something or whatever it is we've done, because we are human beings and we have that ability to choose. But we're talking about students who are showing a pattern over time of dysregulation, of not being able to function properly day to day. So these are the ones that we're really focusing on. So, thinking about these students, I would, as I said before, be really interested to hear your views on alternative provision, what you perhaps have been able to access, or perhaps what you would like to access in the future or now, what you think perhaps is required to support the students moving forward, and what would help in terms of making access more equitable, because it really is a challenge. And I know that one thing that's come up when I've been sort of planning this show actually is people saying about the cost. That is a really prohibitive factor. So anybody who's got any thoughts on how we can address that would be really great to hear from you. Now, I've mentioned earlier on about sometimes these students need therapeutic support. So there are alternative provision settings that do offer those kind of holistic needs assessments and support. It could be things like counselling, mental health support, mentioned mentoring already. And really what they're doing by addressing those underlying factors is trying to support those young people to develop more resilience, to develop the coping strategies. They perhaps do come from difficult backgrounds, and actually to empower them to overcome those challenges and really achieve their potential. I mean, it even goes as far for us where I work. For some students, it can just be the chance that they need to get some sleep, somewhere that's warm, somewhere that's quiet, and then have a proper meal before they can go into lessons. For anybody who's sort of heard anything about psychology and child development, Maslow's hierarchy of need has got to come before any learning can take place. effectively. Now, say there are issues around accessing AP, and some of there's some really valid concerns being raised actually around the accountability that these organisations have, um, the quality, and also actually the potential for students, if they are attending, to become marginalised or somehow stigmatised by the fact that they are being educated in a separate setting. And this is a really interesting debate about the balance between inclusion and exclusion. I'm not saying exclusion as in suspensions and exclusions, but just exclusion as opposed to inclusion, where they're not feeling like they're part of their mainstream setting. So yes, we are in a way not including them if they are accessing an alternative provision. However, I think the flip side of that is we are including them in education. And what we're doing is giving them an education that they actually can access. And for me, that second point far outweighs the first. And I said at the beginning, square pegs, round hole. One size certainly does not fit all. And to quote a pupil actually who attends the school where I work, they said, "I've learnt to trust the teachers here. They see us as people and don't just care about exam results," which I thought was, a really interesting take on things. And it is obviously only one student's view, but possibly fair to say that it's echoed by others, and that may be staff and students in mainstream or otherwise, actually. So as I said, there's lots going on. There's lots of reasons why you would want to access alternative provision. There's obviously the issues around what you can access and where. I do feel very fortunate where I work that we do have access to quite a range of different provisions. So it'd be interesting to hear after the ad break about what Grant has experienced in his area, which isn't too far from me, maybe an hour and a half or so, but a very different setup. So as I say, we will hear from him very soon.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Okay, so I can see we have Grant with us. I'm hoping that any minute now, there he is, he's popped up, he's going to be able to join us and have a little bit of a discussion about what's going on for him and his school, where he's based, and some of the issues around trying to access alternative provision. What he'd like to see for his students now, and obviously in the long term. So Grant, it's lovely to have you. I hope we'll be able to actually hear you talking to us now.
Fingers crossed. Can you hear me okay now?
Fabulous. Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. That's great.
Thank you. Good evening.
Lovely. Good evening. And thank you for joining me at the end of what will always have been a busy week in school.
Yeah. I've done well to get out early.
Oh, well, there you go. I'll have you on next week and then you can get out early again. Yeah. Fab. Grant, do you mind sort of sharing with people just a little bit of background about yourself and about your school before we sort of go into the alternative provision side of things?
Yes, I'm the head of by urban standards, quite a small secondary school in a market town in Lincolnshire. We still have the grammar school system, and we are the non-selective school. We number about 620, and we are 11 to 16. Currently oversubscribed in most years, and doing, I feel, extremely well. And I think that's down to being having very strong staff across all work streams as well as teaching, and also having a good amount of buy-in from the local community. So I think we're very much a community school at the heart of our little market town.
And I know when we were sort of setting this up, you mentioned that, like lots of schools, there are students who present with behaviours that challenge. There's obviously other things going on as well. They're not the only group that perhaps you're looking at. But what is it you're seeing particularly around those behaviours that's a challenge for your school?
I think my experience in discussing with local colleagues and also friends that teach nationally, you have a very, very small cohort, and I want to sort of emphasize that it is a very small cohort that simply refuse to comply with the most basic or reasonable of requests. And I think, as you mentioned in your introduction, they respond either aggressively, verbally, or in some cases physically, or by internal truancy, and that leads to, in some examples, the disruption of learning for others, learning, and I would say enjoyment, and in some cases, the safety of others.
Yeah. I know obviously not mentioning names or anything, but have you got any sort of specific examples of things that you're seeing or trends that you're seeing in particular?
I think just really what I was saying there, that sort of, um, again, quite a small number who refuse to go into lessons or arrive late for lessons, who were challenged and then, to use an old phrase, took great umbrage at that and responded aggressively or by refusing to do anything that the teacher at whatever level was asking. So, and I think it's that was the real difficulty, and that you building into that, you've got swearing and aggressive behaviour. So, yes, you have to take action for that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting there you mentioned that it doesn't matter who the teacher is, in terms of are they, an ECT or are they a head of subject or any, head of year, whatever, or anywhere in between. And I think that's something that's coming up more. And in a way, I think, it doesn't matter, does it? They're all members of staff at the end of the day. They should all be treated with respect. And if they give an instruction, that should be followed. But definitely something I see in alternative provision is they don't, it doesn't matter to them. It's not that they don't care, but it doesn't matter to those students that you're the head teacher or you're, whatever you are. They're not going to do it at that point in time for whatever reason. And I know you said you're concerned about the numbers then of PXs, of permanent exclusions. I'm just wondering, because you mentioned that you have the selective system still in your area. Do you think that has any effect at all, or not?
I don't think it has an effect. I think if we were fully comprehensive, you would still have these behaviours by that small cohort. Again, talking to ex-colleagues who are as far afield as the Cotswolds and Dorset and London, they are still facing those same challenges. And I think it's, I think if you look at it globally within a town, if you know what I mean, then I think you would still have these same problems if we were fully comprehensive. So that is I think it would still be an issue. Irrespective of what the sort of overall context was.
And sort of earlier on in my introduction, I was sort of talking about, a lot of these students will have some kind, whether we call it trauma or, adverse child experiences, ACEs in their background. Are you seeing any trend in terms of like the underlying causes of the behaviours that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think ACEs can play a part, but we've trained the staff in that. We take that into account when we are dealing with individuals. I think I can't put my finger on it, but something certainly changed post COVID. Again. And I don't want to sort of labour the point, but it is a very, very small number. The vast majority of students, I mean, we're quite data rich. and our worst day for students receiving a negative comment,
Yeah.
or a negative behaviour point, if you like,
Mm.
was 94% not receiving one. So, again, you're talking about a very, very small number. Of that remaining 6%,
Yeah.
the vast majority of those might have been for homework or a uniform. And again, so you take it down, and it's a very, very small number of students that were behaving this way. Again, ACs, yes, they play a part, but I think it depends very much on the family background and what the external life is like for the student. Very often, schools are their safe places,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
I think it's a whole manner of causes that spring to mind. I mean, if I look at my personal life, in the last 4 years, my wife had breast cancer, and I had a small heart attack last year. So two quite traumatic incidents.
Yeah.
But you've got a supportive family around. We sort of tried to maintain as much normality as possible during that time. And I mean, who knows? It might come back to bite me. But our three seem pretty calm,
Yeah.
pretty okay. And again, I think it's that solidity of family relationships and support networks. So I think when you have the breakdown of family units,
Yeah.
when you've got sort of traumatic relationships going on, that can only affect the individuals concerned.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that, because that's obviously very personal things and
Yeah.
difficult
Uh-huh.
things there,
Uh-huh.
that you've gone through in your life. But and interesting that you sort of drew the parallel to having that support network around you, because
Mm.
in COVID we had everybody back with their family, and you could sort of say, well, surely they had access to more support, because we had to be with our family, didn't we? A lot of when we were told we can't go out, we
Yeah.
can't mix with people. um but actually in many cases does seem to have had sort of opposite effect.
Mm.
um I don't know if you've got any thoughts on why that might be.
I mean, I think it would depend on the space that you have. I mean, from a personal perspective, we're quite fortunate. We live in a reasonably sized house in the countryside, so
Mm.
got a lot of we had a lot of space to sort of exercise and, to use a horse analogy, lunge the children. If you were in a small, I'm thinking of some of the properties in right next to my school. If you were in a small house with two or three other siblings,
Yeah.
and both parents sort of uh, working or whatever, or it would have been difficult. If you can't get
Yeah.
out, you can't interact. Um, so I think I think the whole everything sort of seemed to sort of come together to sort of create this sort of perfect storm that we have at the moment. Um, and I think sort of clear boundaries need to be set for children. I think I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago by the Manchester United Academy
Mm.
boss, and he's saying that if there's one thing that kids hate more than rules, it's no rules. And I think you have to have
That's
those
very true.
they have to have those boundaries at home and at school, and they have to be clear and they have to be stuck to. And if you say you're going to do something, you have to, even if you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's a whole manner of factors at work,
Yeah.
and I'm sure every teacher is frustrated by some of them, and we could tell very common stories about it.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. That what they hate more than rules is no rules, because that makes me think of two things actually. One being some of the students again where I work, that they absolutely hate it when you impose a rule. If you take that rule away or you flex it slightly for somebody, then it's like the world has ended. So that is very true, sort of on that point. But it also makes me think of something I read earlier this week. Somebody had done a poll on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, And they'd said, how often do you religiously follow your school's behaviour policy? And they've got options all the time, most of the time, some of the time, and very few people actually put all the time. And there were some interesting comments around the fact that actually, we do need to account for, child come in and, I don't know what's happened at home, and so they've forgotten their tie. You might not necessarily give them a consequence straight away, but if they keep doing it. And having that sort of individualized approach, but at the same time trying to balance that with, like you say, having those rules and being consistent in the application of them. So I think that's really key, isn't it? They've got to know where they stand, and they've got to know what they expect and what we expect of them.
Yeah, and I think you can have those rules, but you can have the flexibility to deal with it. So, for example, you mentioned ties there. We're quite hot on uniform, but not to the extent that you read in the press every sort of September. The sort of whether you get hundreds of kids being put in detention and so on and so forth. But we are quite firm on it. But if a kid forgets their tie, we have ties in the office, and they've got to give something. They've got to swap something that they'll remember to pick up at the end of the day, and they wear it. Obviously, if that starts to occur more frequently, we will get in touch with the parents. Again, if it's a family that we know that are struggling, then we'll discreetly provide a tie. So I think you can have those rules, and but you can build in flexibility there for that. And I'm not so naive as to think that every teacher is going to follow the behaviour policy all the time. What you aim for is that kind of sweet spot of a very, very high level of consistency. And I think you get that by supporting the staff, by removing the poor behaviour from the lesson, so that it's quite visible, so that the other students see that a sanction or something is happening that doesn't hamper their learning, and then you sort of follow the procedures thereafter. So I think that's key. And the most students, most pupils, most children want to learn, and I think you've got to provide that environment where they can learn. And I think you mentioned it earlier, and I underlined it on my notes. The key word for most schools in the country is they are mainstream, and what we're seeing are quite extreme patterns of behaviour. You might a few years ago you might have seen one or two children like that. You may be now seeing anything between 5 and 10 a year, and not a year, but in it's a year in its entirety. So that's a challenge, and we mustn't forget those children that are coming into school, conforming with the rules, working hard, trying their best to achieve the best possible outcomes that will enable them to go on and follow their chosen pathway, whatever it is. So I think we've and I think that's where a real good quality AP will come in, whereby you can try and these students that we've talked about need to sort of go out, have that different approach, and then if it's appropriate, be reintegrated into mainstream. But if it's not, they're given a pathway into society that enables them to feel as though they can contribute to society, that they're valued by society, and it will take their place in for want of a better phrase, civilized society, if you like. At the minute, I think the variables nationally mean that some kids are getting a good deal, some kids are not getting a good deal.
Yeah. And I really liked what you said, just going back a little bit, that your goal for them is that essentially that they can be a productive member of society, that they can get on, that they can make a contribution, and you said in a civilized world, and I think that's brilliant that is their sort of long-term goal. But what is it that you're experiencing in terms of sort of barriers to accessing alternative provision that would give them the outcome that you want for them?
I mean, I think what we need to do is allow local authorities to open their own provision, and I think I think that was done for a political ideology, to sort of break whatever power those felt that the local authorities had. But we're getting a private organisation setting up alternative provision,
Yeah.
and the costs are prohibitive, absolutely prohibitive. And particularly when budgets are tight at the moment, we explored some AP, and I think it was 2 hours a day, which
Yeah.
I don't get, and it was almost 3 times what we receive for that student that we were to pay.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's I don't think it's I don't think it's appropriate at all. It's if we had proper local authority provision that could meet the localized needs, then I think that would be the best way forward. Because if there's some things the market can't solve, and I would argue that this is one of them. Because if you, I mean, I don't know what the funding structure is, but even if you're charging, say there's AP units in a neighbouring couple of counties, and they might have 8 children in there.
Yeah.
And even charging 15,000, that you're only going to bring in 120,000. So how are you going to manage that properly and effectively, and give those individuals the best possible start that they can? Because if they can't work in mainstream, then we need to be out of mainstream and getting the support that they need. So I think there has to be a complete rethink of it. I think there has to be a return to giving local authorities the ability to open their own provision that can meet local demand. And where I am in Lincolnshire, the distances, we've just our catchment area is just recently reduced, and we are still 8 miles around. Yeah, so but in years gone by, we've been anything upwards of 15 to 20 miles.
Wow.
Around the school. So yeah, you've got those distances to travel. It's in Lincolnshire. You're quite happy to drive half an hour, 3/4 of an hour to go and see friends. And so you've got you've got quite significant barriers. And again, excuse me, the cost of transport is prohibitive in Lincolnshire. It's if I look at it, I think off the top of my head, I think we've got 15 buses and maybe about 20 or 30 taxis bringing students in.
Yeah.
And when I started in London, the catchment area for my school was less than a mile. So that in itself brings its own challenges and difficulties.
Yeah, and the transport thing is something that I think often gets missed. I mean, drawing some parallels there to where I work in central Bedfordshire, and we actually have 2 streams of students. We have those who have been PX'd and come to us sort of via the local authority, but we do also have students who come to us on a referral system from their mainstream. So they're dual rolled. They belong to their mainstream, but they're educated with us for a period of time. But again, we're serving sort of half of Bedfordshire. Bedfordshire is nowhere near as big a county as Lincolnshire is. But we're hearing from schools who are saying that it's costing more in transport than the place itself for their child to be with us. So they're paying sort of £80 a day for transport, which is more than their day with us on site. And that seems to get missed in all of these conversations about AP. And, picking up on this point of inequity, I mentioned earlier on in the show, it wasn't actually a thing when I was planning the show, but it's something that's come to light in the last few days. This Ofsted big listen, you can't actually select AP as a category on that big listen. So it just seems, if we're trying to talk about supporting all students, that we're not actually allowing all students to be heard, which seems slightly odd to me. I was just sort of, in terms of the system you have, do you have anything similar to us in terms of being able to refer, or is it more the students that are, they are on that brink of PX or being PX'd before they can access AP?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, we've got, I really feel, because for some of the individuals involved in trying to provide that provision, we've got a pupil reintegration team, and that is absolutely superb. I cannot fault them. They're just, they work with schools incredibly well, and I won't embarrass them by mentioning them by name, but we work very, very closely with them, and they're fantastic. But they just don't have the provision. The numbers required currently are not there. You're having, as I said, maybe a couple of hours online provision a day, but is that working? I've heard for one of our former pupils that it is working, and that they're doing ever so well. But I think, maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned. I think there needs to be education. There needs to be support with their behaviour. They need to be exercised, and they need a meaningful curriculum that will fit for them.
Yeah.
And again, this is something we'll talk about later. But I had to laugh when Mr. Gove commented on the school year, and they didn't want a 19th century model to be working today, and yet he turned the curriculum calendar back at least 50 years a few years ago, and there was no recognition of other subjects, and particularly creative. So that's a sticking point. Just the numbers of places available is difficult.
Yeah. And what sort of things, you've mentioned the online provision. Are there other sort of options out there for you, or do you not have that variety that perhaps you might want, especially these students, as you say, who need a different model of education?
Well, again, and it comes down to, sometimes it can come down to cost. Like I mentioned earlier, it was almost 3 times what we were paying, or what we were receiving for this student. We do, the PRT in our county work really closely with a number of other schools, and we do broker managed moves or direction off site. And we will accept students that have been PX'd from other settings, provided we feel that we can work with them. And to be fair, we've had a degree of success with a number of them in recent years. So I'm really proud of that, really pleased at the efforts that my staff have put in. And again, that's one of the advantages of being quite a small school. You know your student body. So my staff, it's a very stable staff. It's a very loyal, and they feel part of the local community. And we've got a number of staff that have taught generations of the same family. Again, I won't embarrass them by naming them, but because that'll give their age away. But so you build those long-term relationships, and we have got a good record of bringing those students that have been PX from other settings.
Yeah, and I think that relationships bit is absolutely key, isn't it? Because these are students who perhaps are going home to unstable households. We don't like to think about it in some ways, but some of them will be going home to domestic issues, to not having enough heating, not having enough food, all of those things, which will impact then on the quality of relationships within that household. So the fact they're coming to a school where you can get to know them and their families and have that sort of long-term relationship, that must go a long way And I wonder, if you didn't have that, do you think the situation would be somewhat different in terms of how many you're needing to support?
Um, I don't know. I've never really thought of that actually. I've just sort of kind of lived in the moment. But I think what it did show was the sort of, again, during COVID, we knew that, and we are not alone in this. 99.999% of schools will know their cohort, and will have,
Yeah.
we weren't anything special. Schools really were the sort of the during COVID, were the sort of bodies that really helped families
Yeah.
out, and I don't think that should be forgotten. I think um, there was a whole false narrative created around schools being closed. They weren't. You know,
No,
they
definitely
were
weren't.
dealing with the most vulnerable. They were feeding the most vulnerable. They were feeding their families.
Yeah.
I remember, I can't remember which Christmas it was, but we filled half the staff room with donations from for a non-uniform day, and we said just bring some food for struggling local families, and we literally had half the staff room full of
That's
um,
amazing.
donations. Um, so I think, yeah, I think you provide that sort of nurturing, supportive environment, but equally, if you don't behave, there has to be some sanctions. And again, it comes
Yeah.
down to the rules and applying them, and making sure that the vast majority of students who want to learn are able to learn.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think that is a function of a mainstream school.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I like to think we give students enough opportunity to sort of turn their behaviour around. But, ultimately they have to sort of fit in with our ethos and our approach um, and our way of doing things.
Mm.
So, yeah.
And I think that is such a fair point, because what we're doing in any school, whether it's mainstream, alternative, or a full specialist provision, is we are trying to prepare them for life beyond school, aren't we? And you have to fit in. One of the things I quite often say to students is you have to drive on the left. If you can't just suddenly choose to drive on the right hand side, because it'll be
Yeah,
carnage.
I've never
And
used
people
that,
can't
but
just choose.
but
Yeah,
I'll borrow it if you
but
don't mind.
you can borrow it. That's fine. That's free. That's a gift from me.
Thank you very much.
Um, but it is that thing of, you've got to fit in, you've got to conform, and for some students, they perhaps need more help to do that. And I liked your point you said before about having some kind of local authority set up that actually would address the local need, because I think this is the difference, isn't it, between equality and equity. If you treat everybody equally, and you say, right, there's going to be 15 spaces in every town in an alternative provision, that's not going to work, is it? Because 15 spaces in one town could be too much, too little, or eaten up in a day. But actually, you need to look at what is required on a more sort of, as you say, a localized level, something that's more specific to your area. But sort of taking a step back from the alternative provision bit itself, if we expanded that out, and I'm thinking that questions where we can think really freely now, not be restricted by current policies and practices and whatever. But do you think there's some more fundamental changes that are perhaps needed within the education system that might either reduce the need for AP, or actually just have an impact on student behaviour and engagement generally?
um, yeah, I mean, I think looking at it, I would I would double the number of primary teachers. I would reduce the class sizes there, because I think um, that's where you're going to make the difference. Um, so
Yeah.
I think, again, ensure that you've got the stat that you've got small um, class sizes in
Mm.
primary, because why do people send their children to private school? Because there's small classes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, politicians are quite happy to see class sizes rise above 30. Yet, if they can afford it, they will send their children to private education, where the classes are smaller. So I think that would be a real crucial one there. I think looking at it, I think you have to have a proper broad curriculum. I think we have undervalued vocational training,
Huge. Yeah.
and by doing that, I don't know if this is such a word, but by trying to academize it, if you like,
Yeah.
you get the T levels, and I don't know enough about them to really comment hugely about them, but I think that's a missed opportunity in some ways, because it talking to schools that have brought them in and then have got rid of them, they said they're too complicated. You're trying to make something far more complicated than it has to be. So I would be in favour of proper vocational training in schools, sitting quite happily alongside the more traditional academic subjects. I mean, I'm the product of, I've got a history degree.
Yeah.
But I think for far too long we've not valued the entrepreneurial side of things in terms of tradesmen running businesses and so on and so forth. So, for example, I a number of my cohort, they're not particularly academically ambitious, but
Yeah.
career-wise, they're very, very ambitious. They want to run their own business. They're very entrepreneurial. They want to sort of follow in their father's footsteps. They want to take over the business. Now, that business, they could be trades businesses. They could be in the building trade. Locally for us, they could be farming. So, I think we need to really look at it and see how we can accommodate all children. Again, one of the strongest parts of our curriculum is our creative arts, design, and technology faculty.
Yeah.
And the value that brings, and yet schools are being forced to sort of by I mean, I think it will ultimately sort of die a death, but that push for the EBAC, and you're pushing out creative subjects. And I think one of the strengths of our school is that students are allowed 4 free options, and we've got we've got a number of students that will be doing art, photography, and a technology subject. And that, to me, that's vital to give them that breadth of choice, and to sort of explore that side of their character. So yeah, I think a proper broad curriculum, some proper long-term planning. Just right, okay, you almost say, right, this needs to be a bipartisan measure. Education is too important to leave to ideology, and let's have a long-term strategy. What do we want to do? Look at it over 20, 30 years. And I think, again, you want to put in competitive salaries to attract the very best graduates that you can. And I would sort of mirror what I would say in the primary sector. I would, if you possibly could, increase non-contact time.
Yeah.
To be able to sort of prepare your work properly. And you hear of these trusts that have 2 or 3 PPA a week, and I just don't see how that is sustainable over the long term. You will burn staff out, and I think that's a big problem. I've never been so tired, and if any of my staff are listening to this, they'll laugh their heads off at this, but I do remember teaching 5 periods in a day, and you're hanging at the end of it. So I think if you can give somebody a break where they can recharge the batteries, they can do some planning and preparation, or some marking, then I think, if you can manage it, then I think you try and give them a little bit more time. But if you were able to sort of double the amount of PPA, I think you would get, you wouldn't have the staff burnout, you wouldn't have people leaving the profession, because it can be the best job in the world. And I think we need to just look at it. If that would be my starting point if I had a magic wand.
That's quite some starting point, I have to
Yeah,
say. Um,
yeah,
there's some great stuff in it. I mean, I just, the whole thing about going back to the primary school class sizes, what you're saying there, it does make me think a lot of, again, where I work. Our class sizes are 4 or 5, which obviously is smaller, I think, than probably what you're suggesting. But
uh-huh,
we do have that set up. And also your point about really having that vocational stuff alongside the academic, because again, that's what the students who attend our AP are getting. They get that English, maths, and science, and then they have a couple of options where they can choose things like motor vehicles, they can choose hair and beauty, they can choose to do catering. And whilst obviously in your setting you perhaps don't have a motor vehicle workshop round the corner through
no,
a door, but I love the fact that you said they can really get to know themselves,
mm,
because you've got that option for them to pick all those creative subjects that kind of give them that expression of who they really are. And so to me that feels like almost what you were saying you'd like for the staff, to be able to give them more time to have that funded properly,
yeah,
so that they can then kind of be the teacher that they want to be as well.
yeah. And I think looking at the sort of creative arts. I mean, and I say this, I cite this time and again. When I worked in London, you'd get a phone call on the Tuesday from one of the West End theatres. Look, we've got 50 upper circle tickets
Yeah.
for a tenner each. Do you want them? And our schools would invariably say, yes, we'll have them. And you might get 30 kids and 20 staff going. And then you would get a group ticket into London on the tube. And I think your total cost would be £11, and you'd go in. So and you could do that. In Lincolnshire, you've really got to plan for sort of cultural events. The towns have a huge amount going on culturally. We're very fortunate. We've got a local theatre, and we can go into. You're not far into Lincoln, but that sort of wow factor and that sort of cultural availability isn't as readily available in Lincolnshire. And I think when I lived and worked in London, you could go to a different cultural event every night of the year if you wanted to,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and it was relatively easy to get to. So I think that we, allowing students to explore that artistic side or the creative side or your musical side or in fact all three together, I think is absolutely crucial and vital. And I'll sort of defend our curriculum to the death, and I think I think that's right. But I mean, I would maybe even go even further um, with some students, and if we were able to, if it, again, this is a pipe dream, I know, but if we were able to offer proper apprenticeships from year 9 onwards, for example, for a
Yeah.
very small number of students,
Yeah.
and then they come out, and what you're doing there is you're changing a generation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're getting students who have had a positive experience of education,
Yeah.
and therefore they're going to pass that on to their children, and they're going to come out of education being valued, and feeling part of society, and they're going to contribute to it, and they're going to be a valuable member of society. So that's a wee bit radical, but I think I'd quite like to
Love
have.
it. I love it, and I think you said about your 20 to 30 years, long term plan.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I've actually just quoted your phrase online, that education is too important to leave to ideology. That's absolutely sums it up, because
Mm.
that it is intergenerational, isn't it? And like you say, if you can catch a generation now that will then perpetuate a more positive view of education, that's going to have knock-on effects, forever. As potentially, isn't it? Because you're changing that narrative around education, and then if we go back to tonight's theme of sort of equity of provision, you're doing a lot to kind of address that, because you're actually not getting the issues in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the case, you know, and I think what the last sort of 12 years or so, you know, credit on the sort of the phonics side, you know, but I think trying to push students into courses that they don't want to do, you're going to, you're going to create a negative atmosphere, you know, and so if it's subject A, you might get the 30 or 40 that opt to do it, will see the benefits of it. The other 20 below them that you're forced to do it might not enjoy it, but can see the benefits, so they might play up during that lesson. The next tier down will play up in that lesson and possibly in the lesson before and afterwards, because they're going into lesson A.
Yeah.
So you're impacting across the board there. And then you will have a small cohort that, because they've got subject A on that given day, will not attend school.
No. Yeah.
So, you know, yes, there has to be the fundamentals. There has to be the basics that you teach young people. But then I think there's an opportunity for more freedom and letting people flourish in the schools.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we could probably talk about this all night, because there is just so much here, isn't there, about the things that, systemic changes that are needed. And like you say, they're not quick fixes. There's no magic wand. If there was, we'd already have waved the magic wand. There's just so many things that can be done. And I think, you've touched a few times on having the flexibility. You said the phrase, your pipe dream, but actually it feels like we need to get away from these things being pipe dreams and actually make them start to become reality, and actually that students can do these different things, that they can access, like you say, from year 9, being able to have some kind of, essentially, an alternative timetable, isn't it? An alternative provision, but in-house. Those students can go down a more vocational stream, and some others can choose something that's more suited to them. So you're kind of giving everybody alternative provision, at the same time as perhaps not needing external alternative provision as much, because you've got that built into what you're doing. I just wanted to sort of draw our discussion to a close. Like I say, we could go on forever, but are there any sort of final things that, in terms of what can be done in the here and now, or what you're perhaps going to be doing as a school yourself? Because obviously we've got year 11s will be taking their exams soon. You're perhaps thinking about the next cohort coming through. What's going to be happening for them to try and support, the handful that do need that additional support over the coming sort of months.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite. I mean, you might reduce some students sort of entrance. You might reduce what they can enter at GCSE, because some of them might have got it into their head that they're not going to do very well, so that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. And if you can provide them with that focus, I mean, again, we kind of stumbled on something 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe 6 years ago. Again, because of the distance that some of our students are travelling, if an exam started at 1 and finished at 3:15, with everything that was going on before and after it, we had the difficulty of looking for of trying to keep the students in the school, because we didn't want to create a sort of a slightly unfair situation whereby students who got the buses had to stay to the end of school, and those that didn't could go home. So we put on teas and coffees and some biscuits, and provided that in the main hall. And in actual fact, a few kids came up to us afterwards and said it was really good, because it helped with their sort of stress levels and mental health, because they just chatted about the exam, or chatted about anything other than the exam, and we're able to sort of relax and just sort of if and they would find that if they found some reassurance in them not doing that particular question
Yeah.
particularly well, then two or three others would say, "Oh, well, I did that as well." So they were either maybe thinking, "Oh, well, maybe I wasn't wrong," and so on and so forth. So we've kept that. We do teas, coffees, and snacks after
Yeah.
the exam. But like all teenagers, they never tidy up after themselves, so
No.
it can be quite messy. So we do those sort of things. Again, looking forward at the next cohort. We've got a very proactive student support team that knows the
Yeah.
students. Again, we've got that stable staffing body, which allows us to know the students, and you know
Yeah.
you've got quite a lot of pull if you could say, well, I told your mother off for exactly the same thing,
Yeah.
and then these the staff, is that sort of generational respect, if you like, that comes through. So I mean, we sort of support the students through it, and try and keep them on an even keel. The next cohort going through, we do uh, we 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 do all or we do the bulk of our exams at whichever year group in the exam hall. So that and whilst that might be a wee bit stressful in year 7, by the time they're in year 8, they know where they're sitting. It's no big deal. So you try and reduce the stress like that. Again, it's nothing. It's not rocket science. Most schools are doing that anyway.
Yeah.
And I think there's a great deal of commonality among schools, and and we keep working to try and ensure the best for the kids.
Yeah. And I think that is absolutely what it is at the heart of it. It's wanting the best for these young people, isn't it? Because they are, a cliche, I suppose, but they are the future, aren't they? They are going to be the ones driving things forward, sort of in the next 20, 30 years. Um, Grant, I just wanted to say thank you so very much for joining me this evening. It has genuinely been amazing talking to you and hearing all your thoughts. Obviously, feel free to head off and enjoy the rest of your evening. But if you'd like to stay to the end, I'm going for another 20 minutes or so, sort of summing up what we've said and a couple of other bits as well. And I really can, feel your frustration there, because there does seem to be a sort of mismatch between what you believe and what you want is, and things that are right for the young people at your school compared to actually what the system makes available to them. And hearing some of the challenges there that you were talking about in terms of access, cost being a massive barrier. Um, it's in a way it's quite hard to hear that, because I think the students, therefore, where I am, we complain saying, oh, this provision's full, that provision's full, but actually I think from what you've said, the students in Bedfordshire possibly have quite a lot more access, and a lot more variety than you've got. So just wanted to say thank you once more, because it's been fascinating hearing your thoughts. Um, and I do hope you have a lovely weekend. And I'm guessing you've sort of got 2 weeks to go, and then you can have a bit of a break and, as you say, refresh and recharge.
Yeah, I'll try to. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll hold on, and I'll have a listen. So if you want to sort of chip back in,
Yeah.
I'll just mute myself. But thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
No, thank you. As I say, it's been lovely talking to you. So, um, what I'm going to do is just highlight a few things there, just to sum up our discussion. You said about, Grant said about the curriculum not having changed. I think there's lots of people that would recognise that. I think it was lovely to hear that the students at Grant School have got access to the creative side of things. We know that, being able to express yourself and your individuality is absolutely key in, developing an understanding of who you are. And I liked the fact that actually, you're picking up on some of these students. They want to run businesses. They want to sort of do things that are entrepreneurial, and actually, that is an achievement. And it's lovely to hear from a school that have kind of decoupled achievement from GCSE results, being the absolute be all and end all. Yes, of course, they do help. No one's disputing that, but there are other ways to be successful in life. So what I'm going to do is come back to a few other AP things in a few minutes, because I have got a few thoughts from the students at my school. I did have to tone down some of their answers because they can be quite fruity, although very, true to themselves in their own way. But we'll come back and we'll hear a few of those thoughts from the students after the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This week in the news, is World Book Day a burden on parents? Has the tide turned against hyper-discipline in schools? Is Scotland going to be excluding more students? Should we be talking up the benefits of going to school at a school that is turning the clock back on mobile phones? World Book Day on March the 7th has become a fixture in the school calendar, where pupils are encouraged to come to school dressed as their favourite characters, or bring books to donate or tell their friends about. This celebration of reading, though, has become a little controversial, as reported in the BBC and The Guardian. Parents have complained of increasing pressure to buy commercialised costumes or spend time and money elaborately creating their own. Some of the pressure has a class element, with some parents sending their children to school dressed as characters from Harry Potter, while others might be the Artful Dodger. Head teacher Fran Davis from Michigan Primary School in Mountain Ash has said she wants the day to be fun without being a financial burden. Therefore, she suggests that pupils can come in their pyjamas, suggesting their favourite bedtime book, or simply in school uniform, as they might be pupils at Hogwarts or even Greyfriars. If you wish to hear teachers' views on World Book Day, listen to last week's Late Show with Lucy Newberger on Teachers Talk Radio. One of the most significant developments in education in the last few decades has been the trend towards positive discipline, or military-style discipline in schools. And this provides the context for the next two stories this week. The first story appeared on the BBC and was covered by the Guardian newspaper. And it's about the Michaela School, led by the controversial head teacher, sometimes described as Britain's strictest head teacher, Catherine Birbalsingh, who has been in the news for the school's policy towards Muslim prayers. Half of the pupils of the school are Muslim students. 2 students have given interviews where they describe a toxic atmosphere of the school and an atmosphere of fear and being stripped of their identity. If you wish to learn more of this story, you can find Tom Rogers' interview with Catherine Birbalsingh on this topic on Teachers Talk Radio. The increasing prevalence of Tiger-style teaching, strict discipline methods, zero tolerance and first-time, every-time expectations of students across British schools was highlighted when a parent at Boston Spa Academy complained her autistic son found school intolerable, as over a period of only a few days he acquired 56 negative comments and several days in isolation. Boston Spa Academy schools have appeared frequently in Education Uncovered and other news outlets for their strict approach involving lining up for inspections and an expectation that rules will be obeyed instantly and at all times. Not for the first time, teachers' unions have described these policies as inhumane. This week, Scotland's Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth announced that there would be a review of Scottish Government's policy on exclusions. The number of exclusions from schools has dropped considerably in recent years, as a determined policy of avoiding school exclusion was adopted following research of a link between excluded students and later involvement in crime. However, with 1/3 of teachers in Scotland reporting in a survey of the EIS Union that they had suffered assault or physical violence in the previous year, pressure to review the non-exclusion policy has resulted in a reconsideration. School attendance is once again in the news. A survey revealed that nearly a third, 32% of teachers and school leaders have experienced pupils being absent this academic year because of a parental dispute with the school. The survey, by Teacher Tap, asked 8,411 teachers and leaders in state schools in England in January what reasons they had been given for pupils missing school this academic year, other than illness. More than half, 51%, said pupils had been kept home because they were tired after an event the night before. Nearly 9 out of 10, 87%, said wanting to take a holiday during term time was the reason, while more than 3 in 4, 76%, pointed to family events. John Camp, president of the Association of School and College Leaders, warned in a speech to the union's annual conference that the unwritten social contract between families and schools is fracturing, and he called for a change of tone in the national conversation about education to ensure that people talk up schools and colleges. And finally, another story from the BBC, where Milldown Academy in Blandford Forum head teacher Mr. Law has adopted the policy of providing brick phones, old-fashioned simple mobile phones for students. Parents can hire or borrow them as an alternative to smartphones, which are increasingly distracting in the school. You can find more discussion of these and other stories on Teachers Talk Radio, or reviewed each Sunday on Teachers Talk Radio Panel, which you can find the links to on YouTube or the Teachers Talk Radio site. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs.
Okay, welcome back to the last part of the show. We've been talking this evening about alternative provision and a fascinating discussion with Grant about the issues that he faces and some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions in terms of alternative provision. Now, as I've said, I work in alternative provision myself, and I do love a bit of pupil voice. So I asked some of our students what they thought, some of their opinions, explained to them that equity and equality, they're not the same thing. And it was interesting, actually, some of the things they came up with. Now, they talked a little bit about where they'd been before they came to alternative provision. Lots of them shared thoughts around, interesting, actually, picking up on a point in the news about toxic schools, pupils feeling stripped of identity. And that was actually quite a common theme, that they said, I couldn't be who I am. I don't like to sit still on a chair. You give them a beanbag to sit on, and they actually will sit for the length of the lesson and do their work. Difficult to implement sometimes these things, particularly in a mainstream secondary school where they're going round maybe 10, 11 different classrooms. But they really were picking up on the fact that they weren't feeling that they could be themselves. Lots of comments around not having the support that they felt they wanted, and a recognition that the school was trying to help. They weren't necessarily saying that there wasn't any, but that the support that was in place didn't quite fit what they perhaps needed. Now that this is their perception, it's their understanding of the situation. So there may well be other sides of that story, but it's still something that is valid for them. Now, I asked one student who has recently had a permanent exclusion, what did you think when you first, knew you were coming to our alternative provision? And they said, well, I thought I was coming to the behaviour school. I thought I was coming somewhere where everyone was going to be naughty. I didn't think I was going to have to be doing lessons. They didn't really know what to expect, but they had this preconceived idea. And we talked about, how there are expectations, there are boundaries, there are rules, the same as any other school. And they said, yeah, we get that. And actually going back to Grant's point, earlier on, that, they would rather have rules than not have rules. They actually said, they've come to realise that the rules are there for a reason. And they quite often then would link that back to their mainstream school and say, but I didn't get why I had to have my shirt tucked in. Why does it matter if my shirt is tucked in or not? And they were obviously picking up on things that they felt were quite trivial. And I said to them, well, what's different? What's different now you're here? And they were saying things like, oh, well, every person will tell us the same thing. And it's really annoying when you first, you can't do that thing essentially where, children play one adult off against another, whether that's a parent, whether it's members of staff, because they know that we keep in contact through a radio system. And they actually were saying that, it kind of gives them a sense of security and a sense of that it is that consistency, it is that routine, and the fact that everyone is giving them the same message. Now, I started to say to them, well, how is that, is that fair? Is that equitable? How does that kind of fit in with this idea? And they said, well, it does. Initially, they said it does make it fair because everybody gets treated the same. And then some of them said, well, actually, no, because if one person has done this, you might have spoken to them in this way. But if the other person did the same thing, they would have perhaps a different consequence or something different would happen as a result. And initially they then went, well, that's not fair. And then we got on to talking about this equity thing and actually that you have that personalised response based on individual need. And it was like a light bulb moment for some of them, saying that actually when we were in mainstream, we didn't feel like we were seen as individuals. And I said to them, well, what would help? And so interesting hearing what Grant was saying about giving primary schools more staff, and any schools more PPA. Although the students didn't use that kind of language, what they were getting at was staff knowing them more, staff knowing them as people, seeing them as their unique selves, and actually feeling valued for that. And that really was, their take on what would make it more equitable. It wasn't, from their point of view, necessarily about having more money or about having more, animals in school or being able to go outside and do forest school or those things. It was about being known as individual people, and they felt that if they perhaps had the opportunity to have that sense of security and belonging more, that they might have been able to either stay in mainstream or perhaps not had the same experiences that they have had. And they're brilliant when they talk about their aspirations and their dreams for the future. And again, Grant talking about students having that entrepreneurial spirit, wanting to run businesses. In Lincolnshire, that might be sort of agricultural based. We have similar students who are saying, they want to be doing something outdoors. They want to be doing something practical. Quite a few talking about roofing, building, trades, electricians, plumbers. They have dreams the same as students who are still in mainstream, and ultimately they just want the chance to be able to achieve that dream, and actually recognising some of them their self-realisation that they did make mistakes within the bounds of what is seen as acceptable and normal in mainstream, but actually that doesn't make them a bad person. It doesn't make them a failure. It just means that they need to learn in a different way. And they really wanted that recognised. So all the things I talked to them about, they really just wanted to be recognised and seen as, human beings, seen as people first. And sort of off the back of that, I did sort of, start thinking about what some of the parents say, particularly, parents when their students are new, and understandably they have some concerns about, what's my student going to experience when they join an alternative provision. But very quickly we get comments like, the school really listened to my child, they listened to me, and they listened to their needs. Another student talking to their parent in a meeting, and the parent said, I've never heard you say that you like coming to school before. Which was, really powerful to hear that. And parents saying things like, my child never understood. My child felt that they were just getting punishment. And again, always with the ride of these comments that they are, one side of a story. There will be multiple angles to these things. But, it is perhaps indicative of the fact that the system we have, it's not just about equitable access to AP. There's clearly some issues there, but actually equitable access to education as a whole. And on that note, I'm going to just pick up once more on the quote from Grant that education is too important to leave to ideology, because that absolutely for me says everything. It says it all. Now, I'm mindful of time. We've talked so long to Grant this evening. It was a lovely, lovely discussion. But I do just want to finish my show, as I always do, with a wellbeing word for the weekend after we hear one more time from our sponsors.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is...
Okay, so just to finish off very quickly before we head off for the evening, I do always like to have a little wellbeing word for the weekend. It is a word, but it's also a theme, you may guess, but I've gone with equity for the end of this show. And I was just having a little read around that term and that theme in preparation for this evening, and there was something in the Lead by Learning article from 2020 that suggests that what is often missed when we talk about equity is us reflecting on our own personal concepts. We can talk about equity in education, equity in alternative provision, but also what are we coming across as ourselves, as our own preconceptions, ideas that we've perhaps never questioned that maybe we should. So I'm just asking people to take a moment to notice those moments that perhaps are uncomfortable, or when you hear that voice that sort of says, why should we do this? Should we be doing this? Because if we can notice those moments, if we can start to think about what it is that's challenging for us, that our thought processes are perhaps going, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. If we stopped and we thought and we actually planned a little action, and it doesn't have to be big, it could be something that's quite small. And again, linking back to talking to Grant this evening, the staff room with the food in it, that's going to have done a massive thing to addressing, inequity in access to food and supplies. I think you mentioned that was over Christmas, Grant. But those little things, those actions we can all take that will be really, really helpful in addressing the inequity in the system. So I shall leave that with you. I hope you have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend. Grant, thank you very, very much once again. It's been lovely to hear from you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.